The crystal chandeliers of the Fort Bragg Officers Club illuminated a grand banquet hall filled with glittering medals. I am Gordon, a senior signals intelligence officer operating under the highly classified call sign of Ghostwalker. While the room was crowded with ambitious military elites showing off prestigious combat decorations, I stood silently wearing a completely plain uniform without a single ribbon. My father suddenly threw his heavy arm around a young combat officer before loudly mocking me in front of the surrounding crowd. "Knowing 6 languages won't stop bullets," he declared with absolute arrogance while pointing a dismissive finger in my direction. The surrounding guests immediately erupted into a chorus of harsh laughter to appease the powerful man. I simply maintained a cold, detached expression without showing a single ounce of anger against this highly public humiliation. Suddenly, my top commander stepped up to the main podium to demand everyone's immediate attention. The room went completely silent as his authoritative voice resonated loudly through the massive sound system. "Bring the Ghostwalker up here," he ordered with absolute seriousness while looking directly at my isolated corner. The entire grand hall instantly fell into absolute shock as the mocking laughter died in their throats. The arrogant smirk completely vanished from my father's face as his skin turned a deep shade of furious red because he could not comprehend the situation. If you have ever been publicly humiliated by an arrogant family member who severely underestimated your true value, please hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel so we can explore exactly how I destroyed his toxic legacy forever. The militaristic atmosphere had deeply rooted itself in our household since my earliest days living on this sprawling base. Our daily mornings always began before dawn with mandatory runs across the damp training fields. My brother Bradley always flawlessly completed every grueling physical trial our father established to test our endurance. He quickly transformed into a perfect reflection of the strict general and earned absolute recognition from a man demanding pure physical perfection. While Bradley spent his afternoons sweating through live ammunition drills, I chose a completely different path that isolated me from their aggressive world. I dedicated all my free hours to locking myself inside my bedroom to escape the constant shouting and military cadences echoing through the narrow hallways. I was completely fascinated by studying intercepted radio frequencies and tirelessly memorizing complex foreign vocabulary from heavy dictionaries that I borrowed from the base library. The ultimate breaking point in our strained relationship occurred during a particularly tense weekend when I foolishly sought his validation. I had spent 3 sleepless nights working on a personal project and eagerly brought him a successfully translated piece of a highly complicated, encrypted foreign transmission. I stood by his heavy mahogany desk, wanting just a fraction of the pride he regularly showered upon Bradley after a successful obstacle course run. He offered no comforting smile or encouraging words when I proudly presented the detailed translation. He simply snatched the fragile notebook from my hands with cold indifference and a look of absolute disgust. He violently hurled my hard work against the far corner of the living room wall without even bothering to glance at the pages I had painstakingly written. The cover flapped open upon impact, scattering my meticulously organized notes across his pristine carpet. He called real soldiers fight the enemy with weapons instead of hiding behind useless words in a safe room, my father stated, with a voice colder than winter ice. Witnessing that intensely harsh reaction gave Bradley the perfect excuse to openly join in the unprovoked contempt toward me. He began relentlessly mocking my intellectual pursuits at every opportunity to elevate his own status as the unquestioned favorite son of the house. He would deliberately kick my language dictionaries off the table and laugh loudly about how I would never survive a single day on a real, chaotic battlefield. I swallowed my bitter rejection and slowly gathered my scattered papers while they stood over me like victorious conquerors. This constant humiliation created a permanent emotional chasm between two individuals living under the exact same roof who could no longer be called family. Despite facing overwhelming opposition and the suffocating expectations forced upon me by their toxic masculinity, I eventually decided to enlist in the military on my own terms. I packed my bags the very next morning and left for the academy without saying a single goodbye to either of them. I adamantly chose the highly specialized path of becoming a signals intelligence officer instead of joining the traditional combat infantry forces that my family so deeply worshipped. I wanted to serve my country using my mind to intercept enemy communications, rather than relying solely on brute force to solve incredibly complex geopolitical problems. That specific career choice officially turned me into an unforgivable disgrace in the eyes of a man who blindly worshipped raw muscle power over strategic intellect. His immense disappointment caused him to completely erase my existence from all his proud family anecdotes during prestigious officer gatherings and formal base dinners. Whenever his decorated colleagues asked about his children, he would enthusiastically praise Bradley, while conveniently forgetting that he had another son serving in the classified intelligence sector. 2 weeks before that fateful party, the freezing winds howled incessantly outside the Field Command Center, located on the remote northern edge of the sprawling base. I sat hunched over a bank of glowing monitors inside the signal intelligence room while meticulously monitoring the audio frequencies for a highly sensitive night infiltration mission. My teammate Sergeant Clayton was leading his elite unit through the dense and unforgiving valley terrain to gather critical intelligence on a simulated hostile encampment. The cramped room was filled with the sharp scent of ozone and the rhythmic humming of supercomputing servers that provided the only soundtrack to my intense concentration. My fingers moved rapidly across the custom keyboard to filter out the background static, while I struggled to ensure absolute safety for the men moving silently through the darkness. The spectrum analyzer suddenly displayed a terrifyingly unusual silence across all the primary communication channels typically used by the opposing forces during these winter exercises. This complete lack of ambient chatter usually indicated a highly disciplined ambush or a coordinated strike that made the hair on my neck stand up in pure instinctual fear. I narrowed my eyes while adjusting my heavy noise-canceling headphones to search for any hidden signals that might be buried deep under the low-frequency range. My years of studying obscure foreign dialects allowed me to catch a faint burst of encrypted transmission that would have sounded like simple background noise to any other operator. I realized with mounting horror that the hostile units were not just listening, but were actually reciting the precise GPS coordinates of Clayton's exact position in the valley. The realization of their extreme vulnerability hit me like a physical blow as I frantically slammed my palm onto the primary radio transmission button to override all other signals. I shouted into the microphone with a voice cracking from pure desperation because I knew every single second of delay could lead to a fatal outcome for my close friends. "Pull back immediately. They have your exact coordinates," I screamed while staring helplessly at the digital map that showed their exposed position among the freezing trees. My heart hammered violently against my ribs while I waited for any sign that my urgent warning had actually reached the ears of the men struggling in the valley. The radio crackled with heavy static for several agonizing seconds before the panicked and breathless voice of Clayton finally broke through the chaotic interference from the field. "We are pinned down, I repeat, we are," he shouted over the unmistakable sounds of frantic movement and the heavy breathing of men under extreme duress. I realized with a sickening feeling in my stomach that the slight lag in our outdated communication hardware had rendered my warning completely useless against the enemy's speed. I gripped the edge of my metal console so hard that my knuckles turned white while watching the signal strength on the unit's transmitter begin to fluctuate and fade. The terrifying sound of heavy machine gun fire suddenly erupted through my headset with a deafening intensity that seemed to vibrate through my very skull and chest. I heard the frantic shouting of soldiers and the metallic clatter of equipment being dropped as the ambush reached its most violent peak in the darkness of the woods. A final piercing scream from Clayton echoed through the audio channel before the entire line abruptly plunged into a suffocating and absolute dead silence that felt like a heavy weight. I sat paralyzed in the flickering blue light of the monitors while staring at the flatlined audio waves that signaled a horrific tragedy that should never have happened. I removed my headphones with trembling hands while the freezing wind continued to howl outside the reinforced walls of the command center. The silence in the room was now louder than the servers as I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen that seemed to mock the loss of my friend. I knew that the fault did not lie with my translation, but with the broken system that we were forced to rely upon in the field. 2 days later, the steel interrogation room of the Criminal Investigation Division was submerged in an incredibly suffocating silence. Armed guards escorted me through the concrete corridors before tossing me into a hard plastic chair bolted to the floor. I felt naked without my security badges because the administration had already revoked my intelligence access during the hearing. The lead investigator glared at me while reading formal charges involving the leaking of classified tactical information. This security breach had directly led to the ambush, where Clayton suffered a permanent spinal injury that would likely leave him paralyzed for life. The investigator slammed his palms onto the metal table with a thud that echoed against the bare gray walls. He leaned in close while demanding that I sign a prepared confession of professional negligence to close this case quickly. He wanted to pin the blame on a single operator instead of admitting a massive systemic failure. Sign the papers now, and we might consider a reduced sentence for your incompetence, he hissed while sliding a pen toward me. I refused to touch it because admitting to a lie would mean betraying every soldier who relied on our intelligence. I felt trapped between a corrupt legal system and my friend's tragic fate as I realized my career was over. I requested my mandated phone call and reached out directly to my father with a desperate hope for a fair investigation. I believed his influence within the military command could force a technical audit of the radio hardware. The investigator reluctantly pushed a heavy desk phone toward me while watching my movements with contempt. I picked up the receiver with a shaking hand before dialing the familiar number of his private office at the main headquarters building. My hands were trembling as I dialed the private office at the main headquarters building. I did not wait for a greeting when he picked up the receiver with a sharp and authoritative tone. "Dad, I was framed. The comm system is compromised. You have to look into it," I shouted with a voice cracking under the pressure. I begged him to listen to my explanation about the signal lag and the suspicious encrypted bursts I had intercepted. I explained that the equipment was faulty and that someone had clearly bypassed the security protocols. The line went silent before my father erupted into a furious roar that vibrated painfully against my eardrum. "You are ruining my legacy. Do your time like a man and keep Bradley out of this," he screamed with a selfish rage. He made it clear that his upcoming award was more important than the truth or the life of his son. "Do not call this office again until you have learned to accept your failures," he added before the line went dead. The anger in his voice was for the stain I was placing on his medals. The cold click of the phone disconnecting sounded like a guillotine blade, ending the last remnants of my respect for our family name. I slowly lowered the receiver while the dial tone echoed through the room like a funeral march for my dead illusions. I wiped the sweat from my lip and looked the investigator in the eye with a new sense of chilling clarity. I realized that nobody was coming to save me, so I would have to uncover the truth myself. I would no longer play the obedient son while the people responsible hid behind prestigious titles. 1 week after that terrible incident, dust floated suspended beneath the deep record storage basement of the Pentagon, where the air felt thick and stale. I was technically out on bail, but remained under strict confinement, while being forced to perform the soul-crushing task of cleaning up ancient digital archives. The air in the windowless room smelled of ozone and stagnant coffee, which only added to the frustration in my chest. I eventually crossed paths with my colleague Valerie, who was a specialized cybersecurity analyst, currently auditing a bank of obsolete servers. We did not waste any precious moments on meaningless pleasantries or offering hollow emotional support, because the urgency of my situation demanded immediate action. I pulled her into a quiet corner and requested hidden access to an unmonitored computer station. She looked at me with a calculating expression before silently nodding and guiding me toward a terminal tucked away in the shadows. Valerie's fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard with a rhythmic precision that highlighted her years of technical expertise in signal decryption. She navigated through layers of encrypted firewalls along with system directories, while I stood behind her with my heart pounding against my ribs. The screen displayed a waterfall of green text alongside binary code that slowly formed a clearer picture of the night Clayton was injured. She suddenly stopped her scrolling while focusing her attention on a specific sequence of entry logs that stood out on the monitor. "There is no forced entry here because someone left the back door wide open," she whispered, while turning her face toward me in the dim light of the basement. I felt a surge of cold fury as I realized that the enemy had not even needed sophisticated tools to destroy my unit. "Find out who authorized the purchase of these garbage radios," I replied through gritted teeth while leaning over her shoulder to study the specifications. We spent the next several hours scanning through thousands of individual lines of system logs recorded during the exact moment of the ambush. We discovered that the back door was a hard-coded administrative password common across the entire batch of radios. This was a fundamental error that a first-year engineering student would have flagged during the initial testing phase. The realization that my friend was paralyzed because of a cheap piece of hardware felt like a physical weight pressing down on my soul. I knew that I had to find the specific individual who was responsible for putting this faulty equipment into the hands of our soldiers in the field. Valerie's eyes grew wider as we uncovered an internal memo suggesting that the security audit was intentionally shortened to meet an aggressive deployment schedule. We were looking at a deliberate decision to prioritize administrative speed over the lives of soldiers in combat. I felt a sickening sense of betrayal as I realized that the chain of command had failed us at the most basic level. My focus remained entirely on identifying the signature that authorized this multi-million-dollar transaction without a proper security verification from the technical department. We sifted through endless pages of legal jargon to pinpoint the exact moment the mandatory safety protocols were ignored. I refused to stop until I found the name of the person who had essentially traded Clayton's future for a faster project completion date. That Friday afternoon, the computer screen flickered incessantly before fully displaying the PDF of the procurement document. I squinted through the dim basement light while scrolling through dozens of pages filled with empty technical jargon alongside abandoned safety clauses. My heart stopped beating when I reached the final approval page while seeing the arrogant, slanted electronic signature of General Leonard staring back at me. This document authorized the purchase of the faulty radio equipment used by my unit. I sat in frozen silence while the realization of his direct involvement washed over me with a sickening sense of betrayal. Valerie leaned forward with intense concentration as she began extracting the IP metadata associated with that specific electronic signature. Her fingers moved across the keyboard while she traced the digital footprint back to its original physical location. She eventually pulled up a map that placed the sender at an exclusive golf club located several hours away from the base. We cross-referenced the date, only to find that he was officially on vacation with Bradley during that exact period. The digital logs proved that he had prioritized his leisure time over the safety of the soldiers he was protecting. I stared at the glaring evidence while feeling a surge of icy rage that threatened to consume my professional composure. My father bypassed the critical security audit just to finish his expensive golf game without any interruptions. I growled through gritted teeth while the hum of the cooling fans filled the quiet basement. The fact that Clayton was lying in a hospital bed because of missed security checks felt like a horrific betrayal of our service. I could almost hear the clinking of glasses from that clubhouse while my team was being ambushed. My hands were shaking with the effort to remain focused on the data instead of surrendering to overwhelming fury. Valerie looked at me with a worried expression while her hands hovered hesitantly over the control panel. "If you report this information to the authorities, he is certainly going to federal prison for a very long time," she stammered with a voice that betrayed her fear. She knew that exposing a high-ranking general for gross negligence would trigger a massive investigation that would destroy our family's reputation. I did not hesitate for a single second, because the image of Clayton's injuries was burned into my mind. The legacy of my father was built on a foundation of lies I was no longer willing to protect. We spent several more hours recovering a series of deleted emails that had been hidden deep within the server's archive. These messages revealed the absolute arrogance of General Leonard as he openly mocked the cybersecurity department's mandatory audit procedures. He described the vital safety tests as garbage theory that served no purpose other than slowing down the disbursement of the annual budget. He had intentionally pressured his subordinates to ignore the warning signs to ensure the project met its artificial deadline before the end of the fiscal year. His words showed a complete lack of regard for the lives of those on the front lines. I ignored every instinct of blood loyalty alongside the concept of family honor that had been drilled into me since childhood. I began coldly packaging every piece of digital evidence into an encrypted file that could not be easily traced back to this terminal. I included the procurement contract alongside the IP logs, plus the recovered emails to ensure a solid case against everyone involved. I clicked the final send button to transmit the entire folder directly to the secure hotline of the Office of the Inspector General. The message disappeared into the network, while I felt relief that the bullet had finally left the chamber. At exactly 7 o'clock in the evening, the melodious symphonic music in the banquet hall died out, pulling the timeline back to the suffocating reality. Sterling stood firmly at the podium with a grave expression that immediately signaled a significant shift in the evening's proceedings. He raised a hand to silence the murmurs while commanding the attention of every high-ranking official in the room. Instead of continuing with the accolades, he ordered the immediate suspension of all ceremonies to address a matter of national security. The atmosphere turned cold as he unfastened a thick folder containing the evidence I had transmitted earlier that day. Sterling adjusted the microphone while looking out over the crowd of decorated officers who were now whispering in intense confusion. He held up the heavy stack of documents before his voice resonated through the speakers with chilling authority. "We almost lost an entire team because of domestic negligence instead of enemy fire as originally reported to the board," he declared with a weight that made the air feel heavier. The senators leaned forward while the generals glanced at each other with a rapidly growing sense of suspicion. Sterling did not offer any room for interpretation as he laid out the facts of the failed mission. He did not allow anyone a moment to formulate a defense before turning his piercing gaze directly toward my father. Sterling looked him straight in the eyes with an intensity that seemed to pin him to his seat. "Isn't that right, General Leonard? Or do you have another excuse for bypassing our mandatory safety protocols?" he asked with a voice that was both a question and a verdict. A deadly silence descended upon the space as all heads turned to watch the man who was supposed to be the guest of honor. My father gripped the edge of the table while his face turned a pale and ghostly shade of gray. The massive projection screen suddenly flickered to life to display a clear image of the irresponsible procurement contract. The hall erupted into a wave of audible gasps as the metadata revealed the golf club location alongside the careless emails. Every arrogant word my father had written about bypassing audits was now being scrutinized by the most powerful people in the military. The crowd's confusion transformed into a visible anger as they realized the depth of the betrayal. Slights against the safety of soldiers were never taken lightly in a place like Fort Bragg. Leonard stood there in a state of absolute panic, while he stammered through several weak and incoherent attempts to justify his actions. His charismatic mask had shattered to reveal a terrified old man who was finally being held accountable for his ego. Bradley had spent the entire night standing proudly by his side, but he was now cowardly retreating into the dark shadows to avoid the glares. Neither of them possessed the courage to face the consequences of the choices they had made together. I stood perfectly tall in my unadorned uniform while facing the man who had once been my father with a completely empty gaze. I did not feel the need to shout, because his public humiliation was more effective than any words I could provide. My lack of emotion bothered him more than an attack because it showed he no longer held power over me. I watched him suffer the weight of his shame while the military police began to move toward the front. This victory did not feel joyful, but it was necessary to restore justice for Clayton. 3 weeks after that banquet hall collapse, a cold and solemn atmosphere enveloped the entire silent military courtroom. The military tribunal delivered a decisive verdict that officially stripped my father of his prestigious rank, while simultaneously canceling every cent of his pension. He was formally sentenced to several years in a federal penitentiary for the severe abuse of power alongside the gross negligence that had jeopardized our national security. I sat in the front row watching the judge strike his gavel while the legacy Leonard had spent decades building crumbled into dust within a few seconds. The decorated career he worshipped above his family was now nothing more than a criminal record that would follow him forever. He looked at the floor while the reality of his total loss finally began to sink in. Armed guards led him out through the side entrance while he wore a bright orange jumpsuit that stood in contrast to the medals he used to wear. He began screaming my name with a desperate voice that echoed against the sterile white walls of the courtroom. I did not pause or offer him the satisfaction of seeing any emotion on my face as I walked toward the main exit. My father's screams were ignored because the bond we shared had been permanently severed by his own choices. I stepped out into the morning sunlight without granting him a single look back, because he was now nothing more than a stranger to me. I immediately drove to the hospital after leaving the courthouse to visit Clayton, who was now courageously navigating his new life from a wheelchair. He gripped my hand with a firm and steady strength, while offering a genuine smile that proved our brotherhood was born from life and death rather than simple DNA. We talked for hours about the future, instead of dwelling on the tragedy that had almost taken his life in that valley. Seeing his resilience gave me more peace than any court verdict, because it reminded me that true honor is found in loyalty to your teammates. His recovery would be long, but he possessed a spirit that Leonard could never understand or break. I wanted to erase every connection to the corruption and toxic legacy that had nearly destroyed my career along with my sense of self. I spent the week completing the necessary legal paperwork to officially change my last name and bury the name of Vance forever. This decision allowed me to start a truly independent life, where my value would be determined by my own integrity, rather than an inherited title. I felt a profound sense of liberation as I signed the final documents, to become a man who was no longer defined by his father's sins. My future was now a blank slate that I would fill with honest service for my country. Looking back at this nightmare, I recognize several invaluable lessons that I will carry with me forever. First, arrogance and the refusal to adapt to new knowledge will eventually be paid for with the blood of others or the destruction of your own career. Second, brute force is never the absolute measure of strength, because a single language translated correctly can protect more lives than an entire armored division. Finally, blood ties are merely a random arrangement of biology, and you possess the right to sever toxic family relationships to protect your integrity. Thank you all for patiently listening to this long and difficult journey to find justice. Your support means everything to me while I continue to share these stories of resilience. Please share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if a family member betrayed you to protect their reputation